Hey everybody, let's talk today about organizational development. One, I think, of the more interesting topics that we have. Why is it interesting? It's interesting because we often think that when an organization is built, it's one and done. In other words, this organization exists. And it's going to exist in perpetuity. However, most organizations only last about 10 years. If you're a small business, the majority don't even last past 5. That means that when you create an organization, soon after, you're going to have to recreate and recreate and recreate. General Motors has been in business for over 100 years, and that organization has continued to transform ever since it was founded. In fact, at one time, not too long ago, it was the most profitable and the most valued organization within the Fortune 1000. In fact, throughout the United States, it's dropped precipitously, an amazing amount that it has fallen over the last couple of years. Can it come back? Who knows? But it's went down anywhere from 60 to 80% from its heights. So, organizations that may be at their zenith, at their top, are going to have to, in some way, some form, retransform themselves in order to be a valued member of the industrial community. It's important to all of us. This discussion is important to all of us because many of us work for an organization. Though small business is the engine in the United States, big business, in other words, organizations with more than 500 employees, employ about half the people in the United States. So while they're vastly smaller in number, in terms of number of large organizations, they still employ a large segment of the population. So we should demand that the organizations that we work for, that they continually retool their operations. One way they do it is what's called organizational development. Some people say organizational redevelopment. We'll talk a little bit about what organizational development is, starting with the definition, but I always like to start with a quote. And the first one we have today is, we need to learn what we can, share what we know, and then contribute to something good. It's kind of a paraphrase of a statement I've used a year or two ago, but it's certainly applicable to organizations as well. We, in the organizations, have to learn everything that we can about the organization. We have to learn what we can. Then we have to share what we've learned throughout everybody who interacts with the organization. By doing so, then we can contribute to something good. We can contribute to an organization that is going to meet its objectives, its ambitions. Part of that is to offer more secure employment for those of us who work for organizations. So we have an inherent need and desire and want to ensure that the organization that we work for is as efficiently created, structured, and managed as possible. Herein enters organizational development. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about what is organizational development, some of the fallacies associated with organizational development, the OD, organizational development process, and then we're going to talk about if you want to learn how to become an organizational development specialist, what are some of the skills that you need? And once you acquire those skills, how can you use them in order to be an effective organizational development participant or contributor or consultant? Let's start with the definition of what OD is, organizational development. There's some great statements that we use about OD. Some people call it overdoes, some call it olive drab, and still others call it the officer of the day. Why do we think that way? Some think it's just a trend, a gimmick that some people use, often consultants, in order to go into an organization, and once you're in that organization, to try to find out what's wrong. Most people know what's wrong. And then to try to come up with solutions. Most people know what the solutions are. So why do we need organizational development or organizational development consultants? That's where the term overdoes or officer of the day comes from. We often bring a consultant in. And organizational development is done from the outside. Bring a consultant in to run an organizational development assessment. Because those who are in the thick of it, who are running the organization at the time, may not be able to see artfully, skillfully, even without bias, some of the issues that impact an organization. So we bring somebody with what we may call fresh eyes to look at the organization and see, are we really looking at the organization holistically, comprehensively, and with an eye to really identifying what's wrong? And it may not be politically popular to say what's wrong, but that's the goal of an organizational development consultant. Consultants in general have somewhat of a bad reputation. There was a saying, and I hope I get it right, something like a consultant is somebody who comes in, borrows your watch, tells you what time it is, and then leaves you with your watch. In other words, they come in and tell you what is so obvious to anybody associated with the organization, and then they leave with quite a bit of money, i.e. the watch. Is there truth to that? I'm not so sure, but there's a number of reasons why we use consultants and why organizational development is a field that's dominated by consultants. Somebody who is an expert, maybe not within that industry or that organization, but understands the process of formatting and reformatting an organization and comes in and says, this is what I see is wrong with your organization. Organizational development really is defined as where you provide some type of fundamental change. Groundbreaking is the same as fundamental in the way things are done. And you do that by often modifying the way the organization operates. A good example would be an organization that was created to produce a certain product or service. But over time, they no longer create or produce that product or service. They do a different one. General Electric is a good example. At one time, they dominated telephones. They dominated light bulbs. They're almost completely out of both businesses. So the structures that were created to build light bulbs no longer exist within General Motors. So if they have that same structure and they're trying to build something different, it may not work out that well. The structure that they had is conducive for making light bulbs, but maybe not for doing financial techniques or mortgages, which General Motors did as well. So you have an organizational development consultant come in who fundamentally alters the way the organization operates, modifies the culture is the way we do things around here, in such a way that the people working in that organization now operate differently, uniquely. But they're more targeted, and the structure is more targeted to what the organization is creating that day. It is the process of bringing to the surface, bringing to the light, those implicit behavioral patterns that are helping or hindering development. Development is to make better, right? It is to grow over time. That's what OD is intended to do. There's so many aspects that are associated with organizational development. We're going to be talking about certain studies and certain models of organizational development. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the traits that you need if you want to be in this field. We'll start with some of the studies that are associated with organizational development. We may not think that these aspects of academia are part of the OD experience. For instance, we look at sociology, psychology, and anthropology. Those are just three. Three aspects that if you were going to college, and when you went to college, you would have studied these subjects. And they form foundations of what we know about the OD experience. Sociology. Sociology is about the study of people. One of my favorite aspects is to learn about people, how they operate. The expression we use is what makes them tick. What makes them tick? The idea is if you can find out what makes people tick, then you can change or modify your approach to dealing with those people so that you get your desired response. Studying people. People are different depending on what community they're from. So people in California are going to be different than Texas, are going to be different than Canada, and different than China. So we have to study people in those organizations, people in those areas, understand their cultures. That's a component. And so is psychology. Psychology is about the mind. It's the study of the mind. In fact, all of these aspects of sociology, psychology, anthropology, and enology, which is the study of. So psychology is the study of the mind. We want to see how people process. You'll notice as we go through these slides that our understandings of OD are about analysis. It's not only gathering the research, but it's about analyzing the research. By the way, analysis is a word that means break apart. So when you analyze, you break apart an issue And when you put it back together, the issue is so much more advanced than it was. So we study a person's mind. Then we study the culture. Very similar to sociology, right? But we study the culture of where an organization operates. More challenging today because we operate throughout the world. So if you're in HR or if you're an operations manager, you're not only going to have to study the culture of the organization itself, but the culture of where the operations of the organization occur. If you're a multinational company, which means that you operate in many different countries, then you're going to have to really invest the time and the effort to learn about many different cultures. And lastly, behavior. Behavior is something that you can see from an individual, and it's the way they act. And if you can study the way they act, then you try to change, before a person acts, you try to change some aspect of that person so that they act differently. In some ways, you try to change the way they think, because the thinking is a precursor to acting. And if we can change the way you think, we may be able to change the way you act. Always not a one-for-one, but that's our hope, is to try to change somebody's thought processes, and the consequence of their thought processes, which is their behavior, may change as well. So those are some of the backgrounds that HR consultants must understand. And those backgrounds form some of the further knowledges and studies that we have. In particular, if you want to be an organizational development consultant, if you want to perform organizational development actions within your organization, those backgrounds that we just talked about are going to allow you to learn about organizational theory, organizational behavior, organizational functions. Also, they're going to let you learn how to research groups and teams as well, the understanding there, and communication methods. Let's take a look at each one somewhat briefly. Organizational behavior, we just learned about behavior, and this is applicable to an organization. Specifically, if we study behavior within an organization, then we're going to learn how people behave, not just outside of work, but also in work, some of their ambitions and motivations. By knowing how people within an organization behave, which often is going to be different than they behave at home. Good example. There's some people that say they have a temper, and that temper may be expressed at home, but it isn't expressed at work. People who are habitually late at home often aren't habitually late at work. So behavior is different in the workplace. Organizational behavior is studying the way employees act in the workplace with the hope of modifying the way that they behave. Organizational theory talks about how organizations perform. We look at efficiency and productivity. That's a fundamental component of OD. It's trying to look at, we have a structure that was created, as a result, some effectiveness, some productivity, some performance. But now the organization is not performing. So you look at how the organization has been created and recreated that is affecting the effectiveness and productivity today. That leads right into the organizational functions. Part of organizational theory is looking at the way the organization is designed and structured. Maybe we need to design it and structure it differently. Maybe we need to outsource some aspects of the organization. We would have never done that before. Maybe we need more technology, automation. Those are aspects that come in with organizational functions. Often we look at particular functions. We look at HR, finance, budgeting, marketing. Just about any type of component. We may call it a department or division within an organization. We learn as OD consultants about research methods, how to collect data and analysis. In a couple slides, we'll talk about why data and analysis are important within organizational development. But they are fundamental as well. Groups and teams. Organizations are created because one person can't do it all. We know that 80% of small businesses have under 500 employees, 80% are organizations that don't have any employees. Pretty amazing, right? That's how many small businesses we have. But if we're talking about organizational development, that typically is more than one person because you've created an organization, because the demand that you have for your product or service is too great for one person to complete it. So you hire other people. Now we have to figure out how people act. Have you ever noticed how some people can work with certain people, but they can't work with other people? If you have two people that are fairly aggressive, there's going to have quite a bit of conflict. If you have two people who are more passive, not much will get done. Oh, you do it. What do you think? I don't want to offend. People spend a lot of time. So the nature of the people that you have can be quite constructive or destructive in an organization. And lastly, communication methods. As an OD consultant, we look at how best we can communicate. We have to be able to listen to people that we interview. We'll talk about interview in a bit. But to provide feedback to what we have learned. We have to be able to express what we learned in a group setting, public speaking. And then we also have to counsel and console people. Organizational developments often are those that development consultants are those that come in when an organization is not working. So there's going to be some stress and apprehension within the organization. So those consultants who come in have to understand that, and they have to approach individuals as an understanding that the individuals are somewhat nervous. There's a bit of trepidation in what they're going to say and do, because the organization is not working as well as it could. What's unfortunate, though, because with organizational development, it shouldn't be an action that you only do when the organization isn't doing well. It should be an action that the organization takes no matter how well the organization does. So those are what organizational consultants know. And the hope is, now that they have this knowledge, it gives them information so they can recreate the organization. Kind of a bit of a change on what I usually talk about with this phrase that I use. I'm making it more specific to an organization, which is the mark of an organization isn't what brought it up, brought it down, but what's brought it back up. And I often used to say the mark of a person isn't what brought them down, but what has brought them up. Same kind of with an organization here. Organization consultants are concerned with what has taken the organization down, but they're much more concerned with how to bring the organization back up. Those organizations that come up are the ones that are going to last over time. It is a rarity that you're going to have an organization, a company, that doesn't have to change someplace, somewhere, because the competition has changed, the customer has changed. And so they need to change their operations to redirect and retarget their organization so that it meets maybe new customers or creates new products or new services. In essence, it's about making the organization better, which was a quote that I talked about earlier. Organizational development is a fascinating field. Those who are in organizational development see it as not only a vibrant profession, but one that really adds to the success and longevity of an organization. But there exist some fallacies about organizational development. And these fallacies have to be overcome by competent organizational professionals if they're going to succeed over the long term. One of the fallacies is that no one in the organization knows the problem. We now know that's not necessarily true. Organizations may not know the true problem, but they know a problem exists. But by having an organizational development consultant, possibly one from the outside, come in, they often may be able to identify the true problem, or they may be the ones that actually raise the true problem, though others in the organization know of the problem, but for one reason or another, they don't feel comfortable raising the issue. It may be a manager, it may be a leader. And there is some trepidation about raising that issue if you're a subordinate, because you may be fearful of losing your job. Another fallacy is this aspect of concealment, where organizations are going to conceal the problem. They're going to hopefully do that so that their own involvement or responsibility isn't known or isn't raised. And we don't see, for the most part, that really happens. I've done organizational consulting for quite a bit of time. I've also done some organizational development work. And it's not common that organizations are going to conceal issues. Because while they may conceal it for a brief period of time, eventually it's going to become known. It's going to cost them their job. So it's not in their benefit to hide issues that are damaging to the organization's future. We do see areas where people deflect. It is in some ways a fallacy that people deflect, and deflecting is where organizations or people highlight other issues that are problems in the organization rather than talking about the problem at hand. And they may say, well, yes, we have an issue with our product, but it's really management, it's really leadership, it's really the union, it's really these subsets of employees. And they're trying to deflect attention because they know if they don't deflect attention, then the attention is going to be on them, and they feel that could be catastrophic to their career. It's not something that we often see. We also don't see dishonesty as much. That is the last fallacy that we see in OD. This is where the organization is not truthful in the process, and it does hinder data collection. It's the easiest way to remember that is when we have these polls, especially for elections, and all of a sudden you see a person who should be winning by 3, 4, 5, 8%, and they end up losing, sometimes significantly. And people will say, well, how does that happen? Polling indicated that this person was going to win. Well, the polling was obviously wrong. Either the person taking the poll was wrong, or the people that they interviewed lied. And we are seeing that some people may not be truthful when asked to participate in these polls or some types of surveys. But does that happen in an organization when employees understand that unless the right information comes out, it could be very damaging to their future within that organization? So once we understand some of the knowledges that we have to have, once you understand and appreciate that there may be fallacies within OD, they're not necessarily true, which is why we call them a fallacy. A fallacy, by the way, is an error in reasoning. Then we now pick a model that works. We search far and wide for a model that works in a specific situation. One size does not fit all in organizational development. So we may pick this model called laboratory training. This is really from Carl Lewin, and he said that we should look at small groups to obtain feedback. As an OD consultant, you look at these small groups and they'll give you more honest, prevalent, within the organization feedback. Laboratory training can work. Action research. This is social research, and you're looking at employees. You're looking in some ways about the attitude, because if you can change an attitude, you can change the organization. So you're looking at how best we can understand the attitude of people, and then also how we can modify that attitude so that it's directed or redirected where we think it's going to benefit the organization. Organizational culture, talked about aspects of organizational culture. Culture really is the way we work around here. It's the way we think around here. And it comes in the 1980s, really, where the right culture is one that improves productivity and culture. So we have to make sure we have the right culture. It may not necessarily be the culture that we need, though, because culture, the way we do things around here, is not the determining factor of success within the organization, but it can be a contributor. Reengineering, and we're going to talk more about reengineering, restructuring, reformatting, which is certainly a subset of organizational development, but that is where you change basic components of an organization. I often call it the building blocks of the organization, the mission, vision, values, strategic plans. And you re-engineer your focus of the organization into another area. This really is a fundamental redevelopment of the organization, almost like creating a new organization. Another model is called employee engagement. Here there's a thought that the issues within the organization may not necessarily be the structure, but it's the employees in general. Not necessarily the employee's fault, but there may be an issue with job satisfaction, employee morale, enthusiasm. The way people act and behave has not been consistent with an organization that's performing well and profitable. So we're looking at employee engagement to see that if that's an area. So in some models that we have, if we go into some organizations, we're specifically looking at employee engagement. You have high turnovers, low retention. Those are some aspects that may lead to employee engagement. The last is management practices. Here you look at your competence of management, your relationship between manager and employees. Is there a deep respect? When a manager states that something is or isn't working, does that satisfy employees? Do employees want to work for the managers and supervisors that they have? That's what management practices will look at. And once we pick the right model, we're going to enter into the OD process. Pretty straightforward. It's probably not much different than any consultant going into an organization. As a consultant, you go in and you do the entry and contracting. Maybe better words, but you go into an organization, often you have a meeting with that person, and the hope is you walk out with the contract. You often don't walk out of a contract within the first meeting, but you hope to make this initial contact between the client and customer, and then at some point you sign a contract. And once you sign the contract, then you start in the data collection. We call it research. Here you gather information, facts, statistics, anything pertinent to give you a sense of how something is operating. When you go to a doctor, they take your blood pressure and temperature, trying to get a sense of how you're feeling. Same process here with research. You gather information so that you can get a sense of how things are operating. We talked about what analysis is, the third step. Here we're looking at taking the information, which we would call raw data, and we start collecting that data and put it into themes or trends so that we can better understand how the organizations operate. So you could have a tremendous amount of information, and then you can collect it into 2 or 3 main themes. It's like shooting a movie. If you've ever seen how they make a movie, and certainly look at YouTube one day, they'll shoot many more hours of film than they use. And somebody has to go in and look at that film and then compile a movie. They call that the editor. Very important person. Then once you've analyzed, then you're going to make a judgment as far as your preliminary diagnosis, our problem, whatever you want to use. Based on what I have seen, witnessed, heard, we believe that the issue can be summarized in this area. And from there, you're going to make a preliminary recommendation based on what we've identified as the central issue. There are several alternatives that you can pursue. Based on these alternatives, our recommendation is that you follow this pursuit. And then once they've determined, whoever they is, once they've determined the type of modification to an organization that's going to be made, then you go forward and create the action plan, which is where you create a plan to implement this recommendation, identifying potential barriers and obstacles, and then have some sort of a contingency plan in case it is not implemented and the results are not evident. Results matter, as behind me it says, results matter. And often, we don't know if a mistake is made until something is implemented. It's easy once something is implemented and you see the reaction of those to what's implemented. It's easy to say, well, I wouldn't have implemented that. Looking at the reaction are the barriers that were raised once it's implemented. You can see that that isn't the right approach. What's interesting is you never really know someone's reaction until you implement some type of plan, implement some process or procedure. Plans work until they're implemented. And then the human element comes in. You see how people really react to it. And then you get the real reactions. But you're never going to know the real reactions until you implement something. It's rare that something doesn't have to be improved once it's implemented. Those who follow this process are often more successful if they have 3 particular characteristics. So when I look at characteristics of consultants, it's true that they have some knowledges. It's true that they understand some processes. It's true that they go through the steps of consulting in a very regimented, prescribed manner. But overall, they have 3 types of characteristic traits that I find are most conducive to being successful as an organizational development consultant. Many consultants, for sure, organizational development in particular. And that is, they understand the academic part of organizational development. That's really the foundational part. That is how organizations functions, human behaviors, organizational design, productivity. So much of what we've seen in the previous slides, we understand that you've got to have this knowledge background in order to know what to apply. That's the difference between education and experience, right? You can have a lot of education, but if you don't understand how that education is implemented in the workplace, it's going to be difficult for you. Some people want to rely on their experience, but then you really have nothing to implement. So it's a combination thereof. It's having this solid background, which we call academic, but then knowing how to implement that into the workplace. Character. Character is often known as enduring marks. If you take a piece of marble and slice it, those slices in marble are what we call enduring marks. That's character. It's the traits that make you who you are. And the traits that make you who you are as a consultant include the need to be respected within the organization. And if you can be seen as that type of person that's honest, forthright, direct, free from bias, and a moral and ethical person, if you could be a good person, then you have a better chance of being successful. Your ideas are going to be much more accepted, even demanded, by the organization because of who you are. I often say that people should be a good person and do something great. A good person and do something great. If you as a consultant do that, you may have greater influence in your organization. That takes us to getting along. OD is a personal business. It rises and falls on a person's ability to obtain the necessary information from people in the organization and then to relay that information after they analyze it to those that can make key decision recommendations and implementations. Oftentimes an OD consultant isn't the person that implements, they recommend. The recommendation is going to be more accepted, more believable, if they themselves is seen as a respectful person. So they have to be able to get along with individuals. They have to allow people to feel as if they've been heard and involved. They have to develop this rapport so that the information they get is true information, honest information, forthright information. And I often talk about how most employees are not going to be dishonest. Most employees just may not tell you what they're really thinking. There's fear and actually real fear, that if they do so, it can affect their standing in the organization. So the three key components are academic, character, and ability to get along. 2 more slides. Key OD strategies. If you were going to focus on 4 areas to be a great organizational development consultant, and if you were going to concentrate on 4 areas so that organizational development within your firm works as expected, those 4 would be: first, look at the organization as to what it does. Focus on what the organization does today. It produces, it buys, sells. It may be different than what it did some years ago when that organization was created specifically for what they did years ago. There's some that are in the car business, and now we're moving to more electric cars. And if the focus of your organization as a car dealer is gas-powered cars, and you haven't made the switch to battery power or electrical, then that could be destructive. You need to change the focus of your organization. In doing so, you go into the second area. Figure out what they do well and not well, strengths and weaknesses. We often call it the SWOT analysis. But as an organizational development consultant, you're really trying to figure out where the talent in your organization is. What can we build upon? What needs to go, quite frankly, and what can stay? And then you look at the structure based on what the organization does, based on what it does well and not well. This is how I would reformat that structure in order to work more efficiently and effectively. Not only do structures work, but relationships work. OD is concerned with, are people getting along? If they're not, why not? What can we do to create this conducive work environment between this group and that group? And then, based on those 3 aspects, we're going to realign the structures to achieve their either current or their future ambitions. One last thought. Organization development is a fascinating field, as I mentioned, but I realize that we can't do everything, but we can do something. And so an organizational development consultant, those organizations embarking on organizational development, can't fix everything, but they really can fix something. My goal, my hope, my ambition is that we create a series, a cadre of analysts and consultants that go into an organization and say, here's areas I would fix. If you fix these areas, which we think are the most important, you can redevelop your organization, retarget your organization, so that its focus is much more attuned maybe not necessarily to where the organization is today, but where they want to go. That may be one of the most important acts a person could have to maintain the viability of their organization. Enjoy their day, everybody.